Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special interview. We are live in Battersea in London, UK, because the ARCHITECTONNECT Summit is taking place here in Battersea, hosted by Dormakaba. So this is the event where architects and designers network, and we are here to find out how security access and design can be tied together to make people feel safe, welcome, in an open space. And I'm happy to have my two special guests here, Ed Parham, the director of Spacesyntax, and Daniel Schepers, the deputy vice president for global marketing communications at Dormakaba. Gentlemen, and I will start with you. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Ed Parham. I'm an architect and I'm director of innovation and design at a company called Spacesyntax.
Thank you very much. Daniel.
As you already nicely said, I'm leading marketing communications for Dormakaba, which also has to do with, also structuring the relation to architects and, trying to also position us in that field, And Architects Connect, the summit that we created, is actually one mean of achieving exactly that, having a deeper dialogue with architects. And I'm happy to be here in London today, talking to you, Ed, today.
I was about to ask, you must be particularly happy to be here today.
Yeah, freaking out, happy. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, months of planning have gone into this event. What do you say? What's the challenge of tying security perspectives into buildings?
Yeah, I would say the challenge is how do you make sure that places are secure without disrupting everyday life, without unintentionally creating a wider set of impacts, making life more difficult for people. Earlier on the podcast, we were talking about things like gated developments, gated residential developments, that can be really disruptive to a much wider part of the city. My point would be, how do you make those decisions about balancing? Who gets prioritized? How do you make sure places are secure, but you're not disrupting everyday life? That's the really difficult bit, I think.
And your take?
Would completely agree. When it comes to residential, I think you really want to allow people to move freely, but also, of course, ensure security. And that's a balance that isn't easy to achieve. What I find particularly interesting, in the last years is the role of critical infrastructures. When you think about like hospitals, when you think about water supply, when you think about energy supply, these infrastructures are under threat because they are also actively manipulated, And there are many governments right now that are trying to actually strengthen the resilience of critical infrastructures, like hospitals. We've seen in the corona crisis, that they are so much under threat, and that there are clinical and that there are hygienic risks, of course. When you think about water supply, energy supply, there's also a risk of physical manipulation. And think about blackouts, Just recently, we had a big blackout in Madrid. And often these blackouts are caused because of manipulation. So it's actively forced. So hardening these infrastructures is what is also interesting and a challenge for us.
Yeah.
So do technologies, do they make it easier from an architectural perspective, or do they make it harder?
Well, I think maybe there's a really interesting point in there, which is actually how dependent things have become on technology. You think of, if there's a blackout or something, you think of like, how many services run on probably 3 or 4 different big data servers? So Google, Amazon, Microsoft, so many services are run from their servers and off those things that a transport network will be completely out of action. I mean, we see it every now and then with things like airports. Was it last summer in Europe, there was the air traffic control system went down and everything ground to a halt. There's so many systems which are, I'd say they're not resilient because they're dependent on data or they're dependent on this kind of digital technology. So actually to move away from just relying on a digital solution would be really helpful to make places physically more resilient. That's the thing I think we need to be able to do.
100% agree. I mean, that's really the challenge, I guess. And I think it gets particularly tricky when, you have technology on the one hand side and human beings on the other hand side, What we see a lot is that, cyber attacks or the cause for cyber attacks often is that people are not treating the technology as they should, So like an intrusion, like a criminal intrusion of an IT system is often happening because people don't behave like they should behave. Putting a USB stick in a laptop in a corporation is something you shouldn't do, because there can be malware and there might be malware, And these systems then also have the opportunity to intrude the whole security system of the building. And all of a sudden you have a security threat that is actually transmitted via technology, but is caused by a wrong human behavior in the end,
Yeah.
So that's the critical point.
So that's a lot to consider for the solutions that you provide. You have technology on one hand, you have the humans on the other hand, which is also the topic that ties back to the podcast that we just recorded with Ed Parham. If you would like to know more about how these two perspectives can conflict each other or complement each other and have Ed's perspective on that, I recommend you listening to the podcast episode that we just recorded. And I say thank you to Ed Parham from Spacesyntax and Daniel Schepers from Dormakaba for being my guests today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks.